is the hymn, The Greatest Commands. Do y'all sing that hymn here? Is that one you're familiar with? It's a hymn that celebrates different aspects of love with each part, the soprano, the alto, and the tenor and the bass, singing about some different dimension of love. I sing the bass part, and basically what I do during the song is repeat the same line over and over again. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That language rings familiar, doesn't it? It's not just beautiful poetic language. It's actually almost an exact quotation of Scripture. Would you go over in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 13? It's essentially a quote from 1 Corinthians 13:7. It is a text that Bible students typically are very familiar with. We mainly associate it with love, although I think there is a broader context that provokes Paul to talk about love there. But the thing that I love about 1 Corinthians 13, especially verses 4 through 7, is they strike me as giving hands and feet to the command of Jesus in John 13 and verse 34, where he tells us to love one another just as I've loved you. I think 1 Corinthians 13 tells us what that practically looks like by telling us how love behaves. And so when he gets to verse 7, this is what he says. He says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And when I read that, some of it is very familiar to me. When he talks about love bearing all things and enduring all things, that is familiar language. In Ephesians 4 and verse 2, those same ideas are found as Paul will describe the character necessary for us to have unity. He talks about that before he goes on to say, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That's verse 3. So the character is necessary to produce the unity. I'm familiar with those ideas of bearing all things and enduring all things. But what does he mean when he said believes all things? Isn't that a little bit odd? What is that talking about? It is rendered in different ways by different writers. One said love accepts all things. It always trusts. Another says love never loses hope. It is always hopeful. My friend and mentor Robert Harkrider made this observation about this verse. He said, of those we love, we tend to believe the best. He continues, we trust them that they act with the best motives. Therefore, we will not judge or condemn them on the basis of fragmentary evidence. Even when circumstances are adverse, love hopes for the best. Well, he did about as well explaining those phrases that give me trouble than anyone I've ever read. You can think about what you believe those statements to mean. But if that is what is being said here by Paul, that love believes the best, that love believes people are acting with the best motives, if that is true, then brothers and sisters, I think it exposes a painful reality for most disciples. We don't do that. We do not tend to believe the best about the words and actions of other people. In fact, if there is a propensity among us generally, it is to do exactly the opposite. If there is a wrong way to understand what someone says, that is typically where we go. If there is a wrong way to interpret someone's actions or behavior, for some reason that is our first impulse. By the way, in complete violation of the golden rule in Matthew 7 and verse 12. We don't want others to do that to us, right? If you say something to me, you want me to assume the very best motives behind your words, right? And yet for some bizarre reason, we do not have that same impulse when it comes to other people. We don't do what this verse says to do. In fact, we typically do the very opposite. And so I want you to think with me this morning about this biblical obligation to assume the best in others, because it will go to the very core of the next principle we want to talk about as we continue to wrestle with crucial conversations and to think about how we can be at our best at life's most crucial moments. I want to begin laying out this next principle by working an illustration. I'm going to introduce you to Derek this morning. And we're going to build a little story around Derek that will work all the way through our class today. So Derek is relaxing one afternoon on his couch watching television, enjoying the day off, taking in the game. And while he's laying there on the couch, his mother-in-law who is visiting for the weekend, comes into the room. She looks around a little bit, looks at Derek, and then she starts cleaning up after him, picking up the shoes he had left on the floor the night before, and then going over to the coffee table and picking up the debris of food where he's been eating over the course of afternoon, and just generally cleaning up the room. And as she starts to do that, Derek is mad. He knows what she is thinking. She's thinking to herself, there is my lazy son-in-law lying there on the couch with this mess in the room. Somebody's got to clean up after him, and so I'm going to do it. And so he's angry. And when his wife comes home, she's looking at his face, and he has the face, right? She knows. He's upset. And so the wife's like, honey, what's the matter? What's wrong? And he says, oh, it's your mom. She came in the room and she gave me that look. You know, that look she gives me like I'm some kind of a lazy bum that ought to be out mowing the grass. It just makes me so angry. She's just ruined the only day off I get during the week. So, here's a question I want you to think with me about for just a minute this morning. Why is he angry? You're one step ahead of me this morning. Let me suggest that if you'd ask Derek that question, he'd probably say, well, it's my mother-in-law, right? I'm going to suggest that Derek's mother-in-law did not make him angry. In fact, I'm going to go a step further and say, people don't make us angry. And if you're not with me yet, hang on a little bit, and I think we can illustrate why that is so. I want you to watch. There's something happening here that is very, very important. I want you to notice that he sees his mother-in-law doing something, cleaning up after him. And then there is this emotional response to that. It stirs up feelings. He gets angry and frustrated. And then he begins to act on that anger and frustration. He's pouty and he's complaining to his wife. Why did seeing those things provoke him to act that way? It's not just as simple as the actions themselves, and I can illustrate that. What if Derek had a 12-year-old daughter who had come into the living room and done exactly the same thing. Come into the room, seen the mess around, and began picking it up. Do you think he would have been mad? Now, I think he may have been shocked. And he may have been pleased. But if someone else had come in, like his little 12-year-old daughter, and begun to do the same thing, he would have had a completely different reaction. He would have felt differently about that. So what is it that's going on in between, right there, between what he sees and how he feels? What's happening that's provoking those feelings? We're going to zero in on that question mark this morning. Because, folks, what's happening there and controlling what happens in that spot is absolutely vital to managing crucial conversations well. We need to talk about that, and that's what we'll spend all of our time doing this morning, talking about what's happening right there. So what is it? What's going on? I can tell you what's going on. Right there in that spot, Derek tells himself a story. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I just mean that what Derek does is he interprets the behavior of his mother-in-law. He sees what she's doing, and in his mind, he begins to form a story about what her intentions are and what her motives are. In fact, based on how he behaves, we can sort of reconstruct that story, right? In his mind, he says to himself, my mother-in-law just thinks I'm a bum, that I don't do enough around the house, that I shouldn't be laying around. I should be up doing stuff. She's never liked me anyway, right? He tells himself this story that causes him to be angry and frustrated. Question, is that unusual behavior? Folks, do y'all realize that we do this all the time in every conversation? We don't just observe behavior and hear words. When people say things and do things, we begin interpreting those words and actions. We begin assigning motives and purposes, and what we do is tell ourselves a story. But here's what's even more important. After he tells himself a story, he begins to stir up these feelings with that story that cause him to act. It is his path to action. The story causes him to behave in a certain way. Let me ask you this question. Is this story true? Is his mother-in-law cleaning up because she thinks he's a bum? Well, I don't know. And guess what? He doesn't either. The only way he can know what's really driving her to do what she's doing is for them to have a conversation about it. I mean, it could be true. That's one way to understand the facts he has in front of him. She did come into the room. She did start cleaning up. Why is she doing that? Well, maybe she does think he's a bum. Or maybe she just wanted to help out her daughter, who's very busy. Or maybe she wanted to help him and do something nice for him. Maybe she just wanted to be helpful. When you factor into that our propensity to assign the worst motives to people's actions, I think we have every reason to be suspicious of Derek's story. But here's the point. Up to this point, it is just his story. It's just his interpretation of the facts. I want you to go back where we started at 1 Corinthians 13:7 and plug in what is our biblical obligation, where God says, I want you to assume the best about other people. I want you to be hopeful about their words and their actions. And what we have Derek doing here is acting completely contrary to what God wants us to do. And yet, brothers and sisters, I think this is what we do all the time. So, a couple of things that we need to learn about stories. Will you write this down with me on your handout? I'm going to give you some things that we need to know about the stories that we tell. Number one, we need to know that we do this all the time. We take facts from a conversation, verbal, nonverbal, all the pieces, and we put them together and we make judgments. And we do it constantly. You may have done it already over the last 4 days. At some point, did you wonder, guys, did my wife tell him to say that? See, you were forming up a story. Or did the elders get with this guy and ask him to say these things before he came, which they didn't, but have you wondered that? We do that all the time. We tell ourselves stories about the preacher. Secondly, we tell our stories at an amazing speed. Someone says, well, wait a minute. Derek didn't have time to tell himself a story. I mean, as soon as she came in and started cleaning up, he was instantly mad. No. We just underestimate the ability for us to do this very, very quickly. And you know, there's a story there. Because if his 12-year-old had come in and done the same thing, the emotions would have been different. Why? Why could another person come in and do exactly the same thing and get a totally opposite response? Because the story is different. You see that? Number 3, stories are shaped by lots of things. And I want to give you some things to write down in your handout about that. Number 1, stories are shaped by facts. This story that Derek tells himself about his mother-in-law thinking he's a bum, does he have any facts to back that up? Well, yeah, she's cleaning up after him. She didn't buy him a car. So that might support this story that he's telling himself. But it certainly doesn't prove his story is true. There might be other information out there that if they had a conversation, if they had dialogue, and she got to dump in her bucket, there may be more facts added to this that change everything. You know, we've been talking all weekend about dialogue, right? That's the key to managing a crucial conversation well. Everybody dumping in their bucket. Why do we need that? Because we need more facts to know what's really going on here. That's true of our conversations too. Sometimes we've had an encounter with someone and we have told ourselves a story based on some of the facts, and we've drawn conclusion and we started acting without all the information we need to know what's really going on. We don't have all the facts. We just have some of them. Here's the point I'm making about that. Just because some of the facts back up your story doesn't mean it's true. Sometimes we need information to know what's true. Secondly, sometimes our stories are shaped by our experiences. In fact, when I tell Derek's story, do you kind of get the idea that he and his mother-in-law have a little history with each other? I'm wondering if this isn't the first time the whole bum thing had come up and if there weren't other issues between the two of them. You know, when you have a history with someone, it is easy to judge everything that they do through that lens, right? So if you've had a rough past, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that they have bad motives for saying or doing what they do. In fact, sometimes our history with someone is so bad, they could have come in this morning and said, "Good morning, how are you?" And our brain says, "What'd they mean by that?" Right? Sometimes our stories are shaped by our experiences. But the question is it fair to judge people based on our past with them? Maybe. If Derek's mother-in-law had called him a bum many, many times, that could really shed some light on what's going on here. But here's the problem. It doesn't allow for that person to change. It doesn't allow me to think of best. It doesn't allow the possibility that this situation, this time is different. Or maybe my mother-in-law has grown and she's trying to, have a better relationship with me. It doesn't allow us to do what 1 Corinthians 13:7 demands. There's a reason God tells us not to take into account a wrong suffered. Sometimes they're shaped by experiences. Sometimes they're just shaped by our own background and experiences. If I could illustrate that, could you imagine having a supervisor that for years and years always took your work and then went to the big boss and presented it as his own? And so you go and you get a new job and you're on the job a couple of weeks and your new supervisor says, "Hey, you've done great work to this. I'm going to take this and show this to the big boss." What'd you just tell? What story did you just tell yourself? Oh, he's going to take credit for my work. You know, you have no reason to believe this about the new guy. But we jump to that conclusion because of our experiences. Sometimes our background causes us to tell stories that may have nothing to do with the person we're interacting with. May I suggest, for example, that at its core, racism is storytelling. We have experiences with another race and we apply it to everybody of that race. It's storytelling. It's unfair. And then I would just add finally to the list, sometimes our stories can be shaped by the mood that we're in. You had a bad day at work, guys, and you come in the door, and man, everything is interpreted by how things went on at the office that day. Your wife can be really sweet and nice, and you can read bad things into everything that she says or does. Why? Because of the mood you're in, right? Even just our mood can shape the kind of stories that we tell ourselves. All right, here's number 4. I need you to write this down. Stories are not facts. It is a fact. Is it a fact? That's what I meant to say. That Derek's mother-in-law is cleaning up after him because she thinks he's a bum. Is that a fact? It's not. It's just his story based on the facts he's gathered. They've not talked yet. He doesn't know the motive. And yet, folks, we make this mistake all the time. So I told y'all Thursday night about our experience Thursday morning in the hotel room, me and my wife, right? She came in after I'd been studying, saw that frown on my face, and instantaneously told herself a story. He must be upset with me about something. Does that ever happen to y'all? You're off busy working on something and you kind of got that look on your face and your wife says, "Are you upset?" No, why would you think that? Well, go look in the mirror. Look at your face. What's happening? It's storytelling. We've all been victimized by that. We've had people look at us, interpret something we said or did in the wrong way, told themselves a story that was not true, and made judgments about that. We've been victimized by it. Folks, we don't want to do it to others. Can I give you all a funny illustration of that? I came across this a while back in somebody's Facebook post, and I just thought this was really, really funny. So I want to read it to you this morning. It's the story of two diaries. The first is the wife's diary. The second is the husband's diary, as they write about the same day in their marriage. So at the end of the day, this is what the wife wrote in her diary. "Tonight I thought my husband was acting weird. We had made plans to meet at a nice restaurant for dinner. I was shopping with friends all day long, so I thought he was upset at the fact that I was a bit late. But he made no comment about it. Conversation wasn't flowing, so I suggested that we go somewhere quiet so we could talk. He agreed, but he didn't say much. I asked him what was wrong. He said, nothing. I asked him if it was my fault that he was upset. He said he wasn't upset, that it had nothing to do with me, and not to worry about it. On the way home, I told him that I loved him. He smiled slightly and kept driving. I can't explain his behavior. I don't know why he didn't say, I love you too. When we got home, I felt as though I had lost him completely, as if he wanted nothing to do with me anymore. He just sat there quietly and watched TV. He continued to seem distant and absent. Finally, with all the silence around us, I decided to go to bed. About 15 minutes later, he came to bed, but I still felt he was distracted. His thoughts were somewhere else. He fell asleep. I cried. I do not know what to do. I'm almost sure his thoughts were of someone else. My life is a disaster. That was her diary. Same day, his diary read, motorcycle won't start. Can't figure out why. Do you see it? The stories we tell, our stories, folks, are not facts. But here's the problem. They do determine our path to action. You remember Derek? He's angry and pouty. His day is ruined because of a story that he doesn't even know if it is true. So I want you to think about that. We see and observe what other people do. We tell ourselves story that stirs up feelings, and then we start acting on that. If the story is where all of this is coming from, then when we start managing crucial conversations, brothers and sisters, we need to be sure that we get a hold of our stories and we manage those stories well. So in the time that I have left, what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about how to do that, how to take control of these stories. So let me give you a few things to write down about that. Number one, we need to acknowledge the danger. We need to acknowledge this reality that we do this, that we tell ourselves story. I have to tell you that this was eye-opening and revolutionary for me. Prior to reading the book, I never realized I told myself stories. I assumed that however I saw someone's words or actions, that was reality, that was what would happen. I never opened myself to the idea that I was telling myself stories. Now, I want you to insert the devil right here. Someone asked me if I was going to talk about the devil in all of this, and the truth is, if I had more time, I'd talk to him about him all the way through this. The Bible says in 1 Peter 5:8, he's like this lion prowling about looking for someone to devour. You don't think he wants to get right in the middle of these crucial conversations? So when it comes to storytelling, I want you to think about the devil. Our adversary wants us to look at people in the worst possible ways. He wants us to tell the worst possible stories. So I've got to get my mind around that I'm doing that, and that the devil is a factor of that. And so there is this great danger that is in front of me. So How do we get our mind around this reality? First of all, I would just like you to think about your experiences in reverse. That's one of the things that really helped me with this, to realize that other people had told stories about me. And I got to tell you, folks, sometimes those stories have been terribly unfair. And I don't want someone doing that to me. I don't want somebody reading my words and actions in the worst way. I want them to assume the best about me. And so the golden rule then requires me that I do that for others. The other thing that I've tried to do, and I mentioned this on Thursday night, I try to look backward on experiences I've had, negative experiences, crucial conversations, and I've tried to ask myself, did you tell yourself a story there? I've tried to see my own failures in that regard. I will tell you what, the only way Derek is ever going to have peace with his mother-in-law is to acknowledge that he's told a story that may not be true. So step number one is we've got to acknowledge the danger. And then step number two, we need to recognize the stories that we tell. There are some common stories that we should be looking for that probably aren't true. I will mention three to you. Number one, we like to tell victim stories. You know what a victim story sounds like? I am completely innocent. In this problem that came up, I did nothing wrong. It's all on the other guy. I am just an innocent victim here. You know what my dad used to say about that? When my sisters and I would fuss, my dad would say, "It takes two to tango, son." Now that has nothing to do with dancing, and I certainly didn't dance with my sisters. When Dad said it took two to tango, what he really meant was, when you guys are having a fuss, you probably both have some fault in that. And I would just suggest, folks, that's almost always true. When two people are cross purposes and having a problem, it's almost always true that there's some fault on both sides. And so when you find yourself telling this story that says, I am completely innocent, that probably isn't true, right? In fact, sometimes I think we tell victim stories a way of masking our own guilt. We know we've got some fault in this, and we don't like that feeling, so we try to find a way to shove it off all onto the other person, okay? So if you find yourself saying in a tough situation, I didn't do anything wrong, it's probably time to step back and say, I probably need to take another look at my story. Now, the opposite of the victim story is the villain story. Villain stories are where we take and put the fault completely on someone else. We have a problem because this other human being is just pure evil. They are the worst first person on the face of the planet, and that's why this problem exists. Victim stories and villain stories go hand in hand, right? I'm completely innocent. This is all on the other guy. Now, I will tell you, and in my life, I have encountered a few villains. Individuals that I just decided were evil people, just really corrupt. But let me make two observations about that. Number one, you are probably not married to one of those. And you probably don't go to church with anybody like that. So if your villain story is about your spouse or about a brother or sister in your church family, it's probably not true. Look back at Derek's story. He's made his mother-in-law out to be a villain here. Wonder, is there any evidence that maybe that's not true? I mean, she is cleaning up and helping out around the house. Can she really be all bad? He probably needs to give some thought to that. Anytime you find yourself saying, this is completely the other guy's fault, we probably need to take another look at our story. And then number three are helpless stories. Helpless stories are the stories where we say, I can't do anything about this. I have no good options. There's nothing I can do. I think we use helpless stories to justify our unwillingness to take difficult actions, to do difficult things. We avoid crucial conversations, for example, because we tell ourselves, if we talk about it, it won't do any good. You ever said that to yourself? There's no point in even having the conversation. It won't work. It won't do any good. If you're saying that, you probably need to go back and look at your story. You're probably telling yourself a helpless story. So, we need to be familiar with the stories we tell. Number three, we need to really pay attention to our behavior. So one of the keys to managing crucial conversation well is learning to be a really good self-monitor, to be able to see our behavior. So Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. All of that is about, in difficult moments, taking control of yourself, being able to look at yourself and look at your behavior and do the right thing. So when we get into these thorny, difficult moments, when I start acting in a way that's counterproductive at a crucial moment, I need to be willing to stop and look at that and say, okay, why am I yelling? Or why have I gone silent and opted out of this conversation? Why am I behaving that way? Now, once I'm looking at my behavior and saying, that's not going to help this. Yelling isn't going to help this. Going silent isn't going to make this any better. Why am I behaving that way? We back up from that and we say, okay, so what feeling is making me act this way? When I read the book, Crucial Conversations, the authors of the book talked a lot about understanding our feelings. And I have to confess to you that when I got to that section, I just thought, that just sounds like a bunch of touchy-feely stuff, and I just passed right over it. I didn't pay any attention to it. And then I read the book 3 or 4 more times, and every time I kind of paused a little longer over that section and began to realize, oh, there's something really important here. The authors of the book recommend that we have a robust vocabulary for describing our feelings. We don't tend to do that. We tend to say things like, I'm upset, or I'm really depressed about that. Okay, but what does that really mean? What do you really say? Go back to Derek's story. Derek is upset with his mother-in-law, but what's really underneath that? What's that really about? Let me ask you this question. What if we could get in Derek's brain and dig around? And what we really find is that he's not upset. He's really feeling guilty because he realizes he doesn't help out around the house very much. He kind of dumps all that off on his wife, and he never steps in and offers to help with her. And so when his mother-in-law starts doing that, it just reminds him of what a bum he feels like he is. It makes him feel guilty. Question, does that shed a different light on that situation? Maybe this isn't about his mother-in-law at all. Maybe it's about him and how he's feeling. And if he identified the real problem here is not anger, if he stopped just saying, I'm upset, and he said, I feel guilty, aha, that's something different that's going on. And so one of the things the book says to do is really get in touch with what you're feeling. Develop a large vocabulary to describe how you're feeling. Then, last thing on the list, get back to the facts. Once I've identified how I'm behaving and the feelings that produced it, go back and look at your facts. It's vital, folks, that we remember that our stories are not facts. You with me on that? They may be influenced by some facts, but they're our interpretation of the facts and need to be subjected to rigorous testing. For example, going back to Derek's story, what facts does he have? His mother-in-law's cleaning up. Does that prove she thinks he's a bum that ought to help out more around the house? No. That's just how he's interpreted what he has. I got to tell you, that is very, very helpful. When I have had problems with somebody, I've tried to make myself go back and ask the question, well, wait a minute. Why are you concluding this guy's a bad guy? What facts do you have to back that up? You start putting those on the table, and all of a sudden, you begin to see some of the flaws with your story. So go back and look at the facts. Listen, folks, the stories we tell are going to stir our emotions and determine how we behave. So if we're going to do the right thing in crucial conversations, we got to make sure we get a handle on our stories and manage them well. I'm looking at the clock, 1 minute. So you have time to ask a question or make a comment. Who would like to do that? Anybody? Have a question or comment about what we've said this morning? I should have reminded y'all that is not code for say nothing right now. Yep. So I think one of the great things that could come out of a study like this is for church families to kind of agree together that we can hold one another accountable to God's principles. We did this in our eldership. One of the things we agreed on is that when a conversation turned crucial, that someone needed to speak up and say it. Hey, you know what? I think we've just moved to a crucial conversation. We should probably remember the principles from God's word that govern that. I think being willing to call that out is a helpful thing. The other thing is that you could use the language of the book to plug into actual conversations. And again, in our eldership, we've seen that same thing. Sometimes we'll be discussing a really thorny issue, and one guy will sit there and he'll be quiet the whole time. And someone will say, Alan, you've said nothing. Why don't you dump in your bucket? Why don't you add to the pool of meaning? So yes, I do think that would be helpful to get us back to the principles in God's word that ought to be governing the conversation. I was going to say something else about that, and I'm over 50, so it just went completely out of my head. Maybe it'll come back to me at some point. Anyone else have a question or a comment? Okay, it's about 41 after. Should I stop? Okay, thank you for your good attention this morning.